After World War II, the conflicting ideologies of the United States and the Soviet Union threatened to unleash another worldwide conflict. Mounting tensions between the former allies and emergent superpowers locked the two nations in a battle for supremacy. Fought through international espionage and the accumulation of nuclear arsenals, the standoff became known as the Cold War. Yet it was a beep, not a boom, that changed the course of communist Russia and capitalist America. The launch of a metal sphere the size of a carry-on bag became a turning point in history. This little metal ball was named Sputnik. Sputnik was momentous because it spurred the world into the space age, sparked the furious competition between the US and the USSR that led to a frenzy of scientific and military advances, and concurrently established the media as a primary weapon of intercontinental conflict. The story of Sputnik began in February of 1945 at the Yalta Conference. A temporary American alliance with the Soviets against Hitler and the Nazis turned into a fierce rivalry as the conflicting ideologies of the two major world powers clashed. The governments of the West and the Communist bloc were suspicious of each other because of the new paranoia inspired by the atomic bomb. Because of this, in July 1955 at the Geneva Convention, President Eisenhower proposed open skies, which would have allowed nations to fly intelligence aircrafts over any other country. When the USSR rejected the proposal, both countries threatened to launch satellites. In a memorandum from a July 1955 meeting of the National Security Council, it was determined that there would be the gravest repercussions should the USSR achieve an operational capability with the ICBM. An ICBM is a missile with the ability to deliver a nuclear warhead, possibly anywhere on Earth, if the operational capability Eisenhower feared was achieved. The International Geophysical Year, IGY, a scientific extravaganza lasting from the 15th of July 1957 until the 31st of December 1958, was when both the US and the USSR launched satellites under the guise of scientific advancement. German scientist Wernher von Braun and his team of Army scientists could have launched a satellite at least 2 months before Sputnik, but President Eisenhower chose the Navy's Project Vanguard to represent the US in the IGY instead. The decision reflected his priority to declare space international territory for his future plans to launch spy satellites. If the Russians launched a satellite first, it would give the US permission to put their own satellites in space. However, this proved a crucial mistake, as Eisenhower misjudged the propaganda impact of being the first country to launch a satellite. On October 4, 1957, the news of Sputnik was announced at an IGY conference, and scientists everywhere celebrated not a Soviet victory, but a human victory. However, this euphoria didn't last long in the United States. Prior to the launch of Sputnik, the US justified its position as the world power based on its victory in World War II and development of the atomic bomb.
Americans took for granted that theirs was the richest and most technically advanced nation in the world.
Initially, the media did not portray Sputnik as a threat to the American people. A Gallup poll showed that only 50% of the population thought that Sputnik damaged the American reputation, and only 13% thought that Sputnik meant America had fallen dangerously behind the Soviet Union. This demonstrates that citizens didn't necessarily think that Sputnik hurt America's reputation. In fact, the physical appearance of Sputnik intrigued Americans. People from all over the world gathered together where Sputnik would pass overhead, watching for a glimpse of the man-made moon.
Everywhere, eyes and ears turned to the sky.
The New York Times mentioned nothing of military matters, and even praised the Soviet scientists for approaching the launching of the satellite with modesty and caution. However, top government officials were quicker to brand Sputnik as a threat to American superiority. Scarcely 6 weeks before, the Kremlin had announced the development of an ICBM that allowed them to direct rockets into any part of the world. The US had discounted these remarks, but the launch of Sputnik forced authorities to take these words into deadly consideration.
And that meant they could hit the United States with missiles.
The Chicago Daily News expressed the concern that the day is not far distant when the Russians can deliver a death-dealing warhead almost anywhere on the Earth. Comparisons were drawn to Columbus discovering America, the shot heard around the world, and Pearl Harbor.
Sputnik could be characterized as a shot heard around the world, and especially in the United States, in terms of this push for basic research, for funding in science. Now,
The Space Act passed by Congress in 1958 created a National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, under President Eisenhower. Subsequent increases in NASA funding occurred under Presidents Kennedy and Johnson. Money allocated to NASA paid private contractors to create new equipment for the space race that was now in progress. The pride of United States scientists had been wounded, and they redoubled their efforts to catch up and overtake the Russian space program. The reaction by the government and media sent the US population into somewhat of a panic, while in Russia the circumstances were dramatically different. The Russians displayed the US as ugly magpies, distorting the beautiful voices of other countries who were nightingales. This propaganda was in relation to US imperialism and capitalist influences in other countries. So, when Sputnik was launched, the Russian people celebrated a victory over what they saw as a flawed elitist institution. Initially, the USSR was successful in defending its advantage, pursuing the Vostok and Soyuz programs after Sputnik. The Soyuz rocket is still in use today. This all changed when, in November of 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik 2, this time with a passenger. The Soviets were branded as monsters once the public realized the Soviet scientists had sent Laika, the lovable first astronaut, up with no intention of bringing her back.
Worries about the safety of the dog they called Curly.
We can only pray in this time of aloneness and suffering for Curly that God will be merciful and speed the end.
Sputnik 2 was what the West needed in this war of propaganda. In December 1957, what should have been a reprieve for the US turned into a disaster, as Vanguard crashed and burned mere seconds after liftoff. This was the opening scientist Wernher von Braun needed to convince the government and the public to fund his program, which successfully launched Explorer 1 on January 31, 1958. There are many scientific advancements that came as a direct result of Sputnik. The satellite itself did not pick up much useful data, but Sputnik 2 monitored the life signs of the first living organism in space, while Explorer 1, the first US satellite, discovered the Van Allen radiation belts. NASA was created as a direct result of Sputnik, and continues to make some of the most prolific advancements in the scientific community, the most recent being Curiosity, a land rover NASA sent to Mars. However, Sputnik's long-term effects unearthed more scientific advancements than just those in its first few years. Most notably, satellite technologies have led to the cell phones, GPS systems, and other gadgets we take for granted. However, one of the most significant repercussions of Sputnik had nothing to do with science. In 1975, the world watched astronauts from the Russian Soyuz and the American Apollo unite their ships, and Colonel Leonov welcomed the Americans with a "glad to see you." This was the first step in moving away from the threat of a nuclear war, a step Sputnik had opened the door to 18 years before. The successful launch of the first satellite into space marked not only the beginning of the space race, but also the space age. Today, the United States, Russia, and many other nations have satellite capabilities. These nations have the capability to send satellites into space for research as well as for commercial ventures. The Sputnik program and the beginning of the space race marked an entire new era known as the technology age. The information age that has come about at the turn of the 21st century is a result of the scientific progress that facilitated the launch of Sputnik. An achievement that shocked and astounded the world 60 years ago is now taken for granted, and the technology that was once cutting edge is used widely across the globe. The after effects of Sputnik are still present. NASA still exists as the official space organization in the United States and collaborates internationally with several other nations, including Russia and Japan. These combined space programs create massive research satellites, such as the ISS, International Space Station. Not only has the launch of Sputnik had a revolutionary impact technologically, but it also endures as a lasting and meaningful metaphor.
It was a physical expression of all the tensions of the Cold War era, but this became the focal point, and from this moment on, everything was race for the space.
President Obama, in his 2011 State of the Union, said that the condition of the US was a Sputnik moment. This simple statement shows just how much Sputnik changed. Sputnik is now the classic example of a shock, something unexpected, something that changed the world.